Hello and welcome to another incredible episode of 100 Yards of Football Sports Talk Radio. I'm your producer, Jeremiah Long, and it is my true honor to bring two men on the screen to talk about one of the great legends, Willie Brown from the Oakland Raiders, and of course through Grambling State University. So without further ado, I want to bring on a couple of guys who know about Willie Brown. And you know how we do it here on 100 Yards of Football. It's not just knowing who he is. Of course, you know who he is. He's a legend. But what do you know about the deeper part of his career? Not just, his stats on the field, not just, his career going into the NFL, but the deeper things. And here at 100 Yards of Football, that is what we do. And so the reason that we bring on experts is so that we can tell you those details that you may not know. And for the details that you do know, we want to give you a perspective on those that's a little bit different. And the way that we do that is by bringing in people like Mr. Harper LeBel, who is an NFL legend himself, and the football encyclopedia himself, Mr. Vincent Turner. How's it going, guys?
How you doing this morning, Mr. Jeremiah Long?
I'm doing great, man. How about you, Harper?
Doing well. Thank you so much for asking. And Jeremiah, what a great introduction. We appreciate it. And today, Vincent, we get to talk about William Ferdy Brown. Willie Brown, born on December 2nd, 1940. Here's a guy that had one of the most influential careers in NFL history. Not only is he a part of the play, which everyone from that era will say, I remember what NFL Films was able to capture. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But just a great player for all the years that he was in the NFL, 16 of them, and 47 years with the same organization, the Oakland Raiders. What a thrill it is to talk about him, and even more to learn and be reminded of some of the things that he did. Born on December 2nd, 1940, Willie was just barely a year old when World War II started. A baby boomer in the truest sense, but he was born in Yazoo City, Mississippi, just an hour, not even that much, depending on how fast you drive. The way that Vincent drives, it'd probably be about 20 minutes northwest of Jackson, Mississippi. He went to Taylor High School in Yazoo City, and we don't know a whole lot about him, but he did catch the eye of one of the greatest coaches of all time, Eddie Robinson. And Vincent, when you talk about Eddie Robinson and Grambling, you've got to include Willie Brown's contribution to the university and the greatness of their football program.
I think when we talk about Willie Brown this morning, he was one of the first great football players that came out of Grambling State. Tank Younger set the tone, then Willie Davis, then Willie Brown. And I think what's so amazing about his story to me in doing the research on Willie Brown is that when he was in college, he played tight end and defensive end. And then he played on the defensive line with one great Buck Buchanan. Now think about this. Those two gentlemen in 1962 played on the D-line for Grambling State University, and both of them in the Hall of Fame. Then Willie Brown played for the Raiders, and Buck Buchanan played for the Chiefs, both heavy rivals. But the most important thing, what I love about Willie Brown, is that he set the tone for the bump and run as a cornerback in the National Football League. They called him the grandfather of the bump and run. And he also set the tone for all the great cornerbacks that came out of SWAC conference. When you talk about Alcorn State, when you talk about Southern University, when you talk about Grambling, Lynn Barney, Jimmy Marcellus, Isaac Holt, Leslie Frazier, Mark Harper from Northside High School in Memphis, Tennessee, Mel Blunt, James Hunter, Emmett Thomas, Aeneas Williams, Lamar Parrish, Ken Riley, Tony Stargell, Everson Walls, Albert Lewis, Rasheed Mathis. A couple of those guys didn't play in the SWAC, they played in the MEAC. But when you think about all those corners from the HBCU schools, Willie Brown is at the top. He went to the Denver Broncos. The Broncos he was signed with the Houston Oilers. Let me back up. Then he got cut by the Oilers. Then he went to the Denver Broncos, made it there. And then there was a trade for him within the division with the Oakland Raiders. And Al Davis said, I had to have him because he would be the final piece of my great Raider teams. And I'm going to go back before I move on. Also during the 60s when he was with Grambling, You got to think also who's on that D-line. I want to get them love this morning. Ernie Ladd. Clifton McNeil was part of that team. Leon Simmons, Rosie Taylor, Willie Williams, and Nehemiah Wilson. I'm sorry to our audience this morning. But back to his career as a professional. And if you look at it, he was a guy that was 6'2". And when you listen to a lot of former Raiders teammates, they said he ran like a weenie. And think about who the battles he had against another Hall of Fame wide receiver out of the University of Arkansas, Pig Sue this morning, Lance Alworth. Go back and look at them films right there. That was vintage. And the one thing that I would love about Willie Brown, Harper, when you consider greatness, it's a thing that you don't have to say nothing. Other people talk about you. Other people give you love. And it was something that brought tears to my eyes last night, really. And I'm not trying to get this as a shock value. But when he passed and I was pulling up my information last night, there was a gentleman that said, I will be a Raider to the day I die. And he touched my family. And I always would be grateful and honored. You know who that was? That was the New Orleans Saints quarterback, Derek Carr. Because Willie Davis announced his name on this draft night. And then all the other players, as you mentioned, Al Davis, well, you haven't mentioned, but he was his guy that introduced him into the Hall of Fame, Raymond Chester, even Mercury Morris, George Atkinson, Eric Allen, and John Madden. Back to you, Harper.
It's interesting that you mentioned George Atkinson. He was in the secondary along with a guy named Jack Tatum, the assassin. George was called Hitman. Skip Thomas, he was Dr. Death. What an amazing name that those guys all had back in the day. But he was brought along by Al Davis when they traded for him from Denver to play with Clint McGaukin. And the two of them together were, like you said, the final pieces that the Raiders needed in those early days to say, we've got a team that's not only competitive, but we're going to be awesome. His 4 years in Denver, he was a two-time All-Pro. He didn't start out being given the honor of being the starter. He had to earn it. About midway through the season in 1963, he ended up becoming the starter, and he played well enough to earn the eye and the respect of Al Davis, as you mentioned. When he was traded to the Raiders in 1967, he was a difference maker. He was one of the ones, as you mentioned, Vincent, that started bump and run coverage. His philosophy was, listen, if I make it harder for a guy to get off the line of scrimmage, he's not going to get open as easily, and he's not going to get the ball. How right that was. He was so good at doing it that they ended up outlawing the coverage style. But he stole the idea from John Wooden. He would watch the teams that Wooden coached in the 60s, and when they ran their full court press, it created havoc for whoever the opponent was that had the ball, especially in the back court. He took that philosophy and says, well, what if we did something like that defensively amongst the secondary? So the two corners, one on each side, against Otis Taylor and Lance Alworth and some of the other great receivers that were in the Western Division of the AFL back in those days. It made it harder for them to get the ball. What an interesting concept. So acute to what was going on that he was named a captain 10 of the 12 years that he was with the Raider organization. And as I said, he played with the Raiders, he coached with the Raiders, and he was an administrator with the Raiders for over 47 years. What an amazing career that he had. If you don't mind, let me read a little bit about it. He started in the middle of 1963 when he was with the Broncos. His second year in the league, he was all AFL. He was playing in the AFL All-Star game, which is what they had back then. That was basically a way to market the organization. When he was traded to the Raiders, he became a captain in his second year. All AFL All-Star game 5 times. He was 3 times voted to the All AFL team, 4 times the NFL Pro Bowl. He was on the All-Decade team in the 1970s. He's in the Mississippi Hall of Fame, inducted in 1994, the Louisiana Hall of Fame in 1985, and something called the NFL Hall of Fame. He was inducted in 1984. He was on the Pro Football 25-year All-Star team, and he was named on the 100th anniversary all-time team for the NFL. Known mostly for the play. And if you don't mind, I'll just really quick, Bill King, the announcer for the Raiders, late in the game, Minnesota's making a comeback. Fran Tarkenton looks to his left, makes a quick little fake with his shoulders, throws the ball to his left. And there were 6 different cornerbacks on the field at that time, not nickel, but dime coverage. And so Willie had some freedom to be able to do some things. He jumped on the route and he ended up picking it off. Bill King says, and there's an interception by the Oakland Raiders. Willie Brown, excuse me. Willie Davis is our next guy. He's at the 30, the 40, the 50. Old man Willie, touchdown, Raiders. The slow motion of NFL films where it looks like Willie is just running right to you into the camera is iconic and legendary. And many people from our era will say that that was one of the reasons that we fell in love with football. Vincent, your thoughts on the very same play?
If you look at that play, and I didn't know that the coverage that you just mentioned, but you know what I took away from that play? He was really covering Sammy White. If you go back, and both of them went to Grambling State University, and both guys came under Eddie Robertson. That's what sticks out in my mind on that play most of all. And just the game itself. Played in Pasadena. It was early game out there in California. And John Madden winning his first Super Bowl. And the Raiders had been knocking at the door for so long. And finally getting on the hump. And then the cast of characters they had. Henrich, Stabler, Bilikov, Tatum, Atkinson. And then they had a quality guy in old man Willie Brown. Back to you, Harper.
Yeah, think of Otis Sistrunk,
Yes, sir.
Ted the Stork Hendricks, as I mentioned, the secondary with George Atkinson, and obviously the assassin himself, Jack Tatum. Oh my goodness, what an amazing team that they had. And they had to fight through some issues. If you remember, the Miami Dolphins in 72, 73 were the best team in the league by far, a young team. Coached by Don Shula, an expansion team that started later than the Raiders organization did, but got better quicker. Then the Pittsburgh Steelers, obviously, the Denver Broncos, great teams that played in the Super Bowl throughout the 70s, where really the mainstays in the NFL from the NFC side were Minnesota and Dallas. There was one year in 72 where Washington played in the Super Bowl, but every other year, in the 70s, it was a choice between Dallas, and Minnesota. Those are the only 2 teams that played throughout the decade, other than the Washington Redskins. But remember now, Willie was a member of the 69 team, or the AFC champions, that played against the Super Bowl champion Green Bay Packers in Miami. So they lost Super Bowl II. He was an AFL champion, but they didn't win the Super Bowl. Then they finally win Super Bowl 11. He wins 2 more with the Raiders as a coach, and then he was an administrator with the organization throughout the rest of his career. So many things that he did. Let me just read a couple others for you. Pro Bowl, Super Bowl champion many times. He had 54 interceptions in his career. 2 of them he scored. The one that we just talked about, the play, is one of them. He had 4 interceptions in one game. Why would you throw even in that area? At the end of the game, after 3, you figured you'd catch on, but he has an NFL record with that. He had 4 fumble recoveries, 2 for touchdowns, and a fantastic career. He was a head coach at Long Beach State in 1991. Oddly enough, the program dissolved soon after that. Not his fault, of course. But real quick, I'd like to read something that Al Davis had to say about him. And Al Davis would use these pronouns and adjectives and make everybody seem like they were incredible. And he was. Thank you very much for 3 memorable decades. Oakland and the Los Angeles Raiders backed the greatest players, the greatest coaches, and some of the greatest performances the game has ever seen. Willie Brown was one of the greatest. Willie Brown is one of the great coaches and players. Today is a day of glory for me, Al says. It's a great honor for me to serve in this role. And I've shared in many of Willie Brown's moments in his life. For his family, for his friends, I have a strong admiration for both. And Al would go on to introduce him and be the first to induct him. And Willie says this: "Thank you very much. You know, what can I say after all of that? It's an amazing thing when you're dealing with Al for a contract. Not any of these great things that he said about me came up about how great I was during the contract negotiation. For your information, I had a contract negotiation in one particular instant where I told Al if I ever made the Hall of Fame, he'd owe me $1 million. So I guess today is the day that we'll have to deal with that, Al, when we get back from this day." What an amazing sense of humor, a fun guy, a contributor to the game, but also a human being that touched others' lives. When he died, owner Mark Davis, Al's son, said, "The Raiders have lost one of their great players, one of their great coaches, one of the great administrators. But me, I lost a friend." When Willie Davis died, Mark honored him in his service to Mark's mother, Miss Carol Davis, Al's wife. He would help her down the stairs when they would get off the plane, when they would travel. He would have dinner with her in the team meals where she was invited to be a part of it. He'd have conversations with her at times when no one else would be around. Mark Davis said, "The way that man treated my mom made me love and admire him so much more than I ever could as just a player. He was a great human being." So I want to say thank you, Willie Brown, for being a great player, for being a great contributor to the game of football, but also for being a great human being. You would see him at card shows and he'd be signing, there were smiles on his face, and so many wonderful things that we will remember him for. And I'm glad, Vincent, that you brought him up and wanted to honor him today.
I think when you think about Willie Brown, one thing I want to bring up, a very important point, the 1963 draft. To all the people out there with scouting talent, what were you thinking about? Were you insane? Because I look at those players that was drafted in the first round: Bill Munson, quarterback, Utah State; Scott Appleton, offensive tackle, Texas; and Paul Warfield, Ohio State. What were y'all thinking? Insanity for not taking Willie Brown, not even getting him drafted. Then I think about Willie Brown not only was a great player on the field, but think about his coaching ability. Mike Haynes, Hall of Famer. Charles Woodson, Hall of Famer. Lester Hayes will be a Hall of Famer. Three of the greatest cornerbacks that's played this game at that level. And then family. When you think about Willie Brown, and my final words about the great man from Yazoo, Mississippi, is this: physical, speed, and the great Raider saying, commitment to excellence. And of course, I always say this: anybody from that great state of Mississippi who back in those times really didn't get a lot of love, but think about all the great people that came out of that state: James Earl Jones, Morgan Freeman, Elvis Presley, and R.T. Manning. We can include Willie Brown in that Lord today, along with my parents, Chester and Inez Turner, who's still living at 88 and 86 years old. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Much respect to you, Willie Brown. Not only you loved on the field, not only you loved in the office, but I can tell you today, Vincent W. Turner and Harper LeBel got great love for you. Back to you, Harper.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that the man did, and the greatness for the great state of Mississippi that's included for Chester and Inez. I know they would appreciate talking about Willie Brown and what he did. We certainly lost a great one on October 21st, 2019, just a few years ago. So on behalf of Jeremiah Long, our producer and engineer, Vincent Turner, our host, I'm Harper LeBel. We want to say thank you for tuning in to another episode of 100 Yards of Football, the Legends Edition. And today's legend is the great Willie Brown. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. We appreciate it, and have a great day, everybody.